That's so weird.
Yeah,
I
I
don't
know, I
understand
know,
it. I
really.
can't believe it. That's just it. I don't have
It's
it.
weird.
I
And,
don't understand it.
and then I was talking to Michael, and he told me that I said, well, I don't have anything orange. He said, well, if you go out, then they'll put you in jail. He was joking, I think. Which is kind of funny because in Texas, if you're put in jail, they put orange on you, right? Well, that would make sense to me then.
Right, I think we're good to jump back in.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so lessons of faith, and I can read. I'm feeling all right now, but let's see. So the lessons of faith we learned from Rahab is you can communicate faith, discipline of faith, patience of faith, thank and rejoice in faith, and build faith by remembering. So it's basically it's a lesson of faith. The Rahab's pretty cool. All right, now let's jump into chapter 3 and 4. So in chapter 3 and 4, you're going to see Joshua and company arrived at the Jordan River with fast running water. They set up camp for 3 days. Then the priests carrying the ark placed their feet in the water. The river stopped its flow, and the people crossed over on dry land, while the priest and the ark remained in the middle. So marching behind the ark reinforces the theological belief that God is our supreme commander and leads Israel. And then only the Lord knows the future and can guide people to victory in the land of Canaan. So the people remained a half mile, calculated that out. It's about a half mile, which would be, what, in kilometers?
Less than 1 kilo?
Huh?
800 meters or something like that.
It's about a kilometer. Half mile is about a kilometer, I think. Yeah. A little bit less. All right. So anyway, they remain about a kilometer, a little less than a kilometer behind the ark in respect for the power of God, because the Lord is holy and His holiness is dangerous. So at every point, the people depend on God, for they do not know the way to victory. He's leading the way to victory for them. So the journey to Canaan depends on God showing them the way. So He's the guide. We say He's the truth. He is the guide. So one out of the wonders of crossing came 2 results. First, that the day that the Lord made great or exalted Joshua in the sight of all Israel, then they revered him all the days of his life, just as they had revered Moses, which we already read that. That's in Joshua 4:14. And then Joshua's leadership was viewed almost identically as that of Moses. So again, that might be the parallels that we see. God was doing these parallels between Moses and Joshua. That was his way of exalting Joshua and giving the people faith in Joshua as they had in his mighty servant Moses. So it was you could say it's planned out that way. So God's power and might also became well known to everyone. They might have heard of the story of the crossing leaving Egypt in the Exodus, but now this generation was actually witnessing. So that crossing was again showing the hand of God and the all-powerful might of God, and that we see in Joshua 4:24. And then through the event, all the nations of the world would know that God freed the slaves, and that He was basically doing that. Again, He was leading them across this body of water into the land of Canaan, the promised land. So then the subsequent part of that recognition calls upon the people to respect and worship God. So both Joshua and God gain obedience from the people and then status from those wonders by the Jordan. So Joshua 4:6, this is what it had stones in the middle of the river there, created a story to match the standing stones on other phenomena, natural phenomena. So actually I saw that in Nepal when I'm trekking through Nepal. I went to Nepal in December, and then in January I led this like small group of Nepali Christians into the Mount Everest region of Nepal, and it's a crazy region. They have a lot of Hindu and Buddhist influence, and they have prayer rocks. I mean, prayer rocks in villages. The rock is the size of this room. I mean, it's huge, and the monks have carved prayers like the letters in Sanskrit are this big, you know, and then there's chortens, which are or stupas. These are like man-made like altars. Sometimes they have the relics of famous lamas or priests inside them, and so people are supposed to always go around to the left. There's one. I mean, there's so many of them. There's hundreds, maybe thousands, through that area. And so we went through just praying over those. It was a prayer walk, but it was we got up to like about 13,000 feet. Was that 4 kilometers? 4,000 meters. About 4,000 meters. We went up 4,000 meters. It was very hard for me. Like, not enough oxygen. But during the way, there was like these like little piles of stone, and I was like, I don't really know what they mean in Hindu or Buddhist philosophy, but they reminded me of the Bible. And so, what those are, these natural phenomena, or these stones that people pile up for remembrance, are called etiology. Etiology is it's not unique to Israel. And in comparative literature in the ancient Near East, a lot of people did that. So it explained geographical phenomena or liturgical ceremony, and people would tell stories about it. So it was a way of remembering. So okay, let's see, entry in the Promised Land in chapter 5. So first they see the wonders of crossing the Jordan demoralized the enemy, because they heard about it. They either saw it or they heard about it, and that demoralized the enemy. So it was like a psychological warfare also God was playing on the Canaanites. Everybody looked at them and said, oh, their God is with them, you know. And so the enemy kings then said their hearts melted in fear, and they no longer had courage to face the Israelites. And so they said they had no spirit left in them to fight the fight. So Rahab's analysis proved true for a lot of the Canaanites who had fear. They're melting their hearts, a loss of spirit. And when they hear of God's victories east of the Jordan, then Jericho and then the cities become vulnerable when the God of their tribes conquers the Jordan. And then Joshua circumcised the second generation, as those leaving Egypt had been circumcised. So we read about that already. In, verses 4 through 7. And then after the circumcision, the men remain in the camp until they are healed and ready for battle. So circumcision in the Old Testament represents the outward sign of an inward condition. So now we talk about circumcision of the heart. But at that time, circumcision marked every male child as a descendant of Abraham. And we see that in Genesis 17:10. So that circumcision at Gilgal brings a declaration from the Lord that he says, today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you, in Joshua 5:9. And he basically declares that, all right, you were slaves So all the people in Canaan are going to see these bunch of slaves coming, and they had their own presuppositions about what slaves were. And so he's removing that, rolling away their embarrassment over slavery in Egypt, and showing that they are victorious over evil. So now it's not only for their own psychological empowering, but it's also a statement to all of the people that they're enemies that they're about to meet, that they are now victorious over evil. And of course the Canaanites were considered the evil ones. So in a spiritual sense, that change of heart became really crucial for their victories. And for the same for us in our Christian life, then circumcision is a circumcision of the heart, and it prepares us to possess the land and to defeat our enemies in spiritual warfare. And for them, it was defeating the kings of the Amorites and the Canaanites. And so now the people were not seeing them as just slaves, but as God's army. Also, it's Joshua 5:10 through 12. It says, circumcision now qualified the community to celebrate the Passover. So, and they could eat the Seder meal. So that celebration follows those days on which the people celebrated the Passover in Egypt. And then communion does not just feed the congregation a meal, but rather empowers them through prayer and efforts to conquer evil. So again, it's another empowering ritual that God is giving his people. So the circumcision was not just an outward sign, but it also was an inward change of heart, inward victory. And then once the people are prepared to do battle in the name of the Lord, we see in 5:13 and 15, Joshua meets with the commander of the Lord's army near Jericho. So that's when the angel of the Lord appears, and Joshua says, what message does my Lord have for his servant? And the commander said, what did he say?
Take off your sandals.
Take off your sandals. Like,
Yeah.
okay. He said, take off your sandals, for this place is where you're standing is holy. So that command parallels Moses, and when Moses was at the burning bush, and the Lord calls on Moses to liberate the people and gives him a divine name in Exodus 3:5. So again, this is a parallel. So now the commander of the Lord is telling him to take off his sandals because you are on holy ground, and you are about to liberate your people by bringing them in and conquering the Canaanites and giving them the land that God promised you. So both of those speeches tell men to take off their power symbols, which at that time sandals were power symbols for men. And so Joshua 5 ends then when the commander of the heavenly host tells Joshua that Jericho and the land of Canaan belong to him. So the Lord has made this final divine decree and can give that city to the people. So again, he's telling them that this is the Lord's land. He's giving it to you, but you are the Lord's army. So again, trying to reinforce that idea that they are not going on their own strength, they're going on the Lord's strength. So Joshua follows the orders and recognizes the holiness of God in the land of Canaan, and that's basically the main message, that they can only obey the commander-in-chief of the Lord. So they circumcised themselves, they celebrated the Passover, the manna ceased to come down, and they ate the produce of the land, and then Joshua meets the commander of the Lord. All right, so let's talk a little bit about Joshua's victories. There you go. So under Joshua's leadership, the people of Israel entered Canaan about 1405 BC to drive out the Canaanites and claim the land of promise. So we can see, and I already said that a little bit, that Joshua's military campaign, he had it well planned out. It was a strategy that he had going into the center first. So he established the Israelites in the central part of Canaan, and then moved north and south from there, so that prevented the Canaanites from coming together. And so you see those, you'll read that today in Joshua 1 through 11, and that covered a period of about 7 years, from 1405 to 1398. And by the time Joshua died in 2429, the Israelites had driven most of the Canaanites out of Palestine and divided the land among the 12 tribes of Israel. But you'll find out that they didn't completely drive everybody out, and he actually gives some of the land to the tribes that's still occupied and says, all right, now you've got to go drive them out yourself. All right, then in chapter 6, we read about the victory at Jericho. So, you probably all heard that story before, yeah? As a child, you march around in Sunday school. Okay, so Jericho is believed to be one of the oldest cities in the world. And in the Bible, it's known as the location of this miracle that God performed. And Jericho was the first city conquered by Israel after crossing the Jordan and occupying the promised land. We see that in Joshua 5:13 through 6:23. So Jericho's location was very significant. The city was situated in the lower Jordan Valley, just west of the Jordan River, and then about 10 miles northwest of the Dead Sea. And it's set at the broadest part of the Jordan Plain, more than 800 feet below sea level. So, and it was about 3,500 feet below Jerusalem, which is only 17 miles away. So it was pretty like downhill from Jerusalem. So that explains why Jesus said later in a parable in Luke 10:30 that the Good Samaritan went down from Jerusalem to Jericho. It was a downward descent to Jericho. And in contrast to the rest of the desert, which was very dry and parched, Jericho was very fertile. It was spring-fed, like kind of what we think about as an oasis. And it's often called the city of palms because it had a lot of palm trees. So I always think of it like, I don't know, that was always part of American culture and part of cartoons where you were in the desert and then you had this view of this water or an oasis. You didn't really know whether it was real or not. I don't know. So you always saw, it was always like seeing Jericho, the island, the land of palms, the city of palms, I mean. Strategically, it was located as a border city against, it was a border city, and then it was controlled important migration routes between the north and the south, and the east and the west. So it was very strategically located. And then later it became a part of the tribe of Benjamin's allotment. So Jericho was the first city standing in the way of Israel, as I said, in their move into the promised land. It was a very secure fortress because of its location. It was very high and very strong, formidable walls. And then before the battle, God gave Joshua some very specific instructions for the men of war to march in silence around the city each day for 6 days. He said the priests were then to walk with them, blowing the ram's horns and carrying the Ark of the Covenant as a sign of God's presence among them. And then on the 7th day, they were to march around the city 7 times. And then at the appropriate time or signal, the priests were to blow their trumpets, and the people were to give a mighty shout And so they did exactly as the Lord commanded. And on the seventh day, the walls of Jericho came crumbling down, falling down. So the soldiers went in, took the city, destroyed it completely, and only Rahab and her family were spared. So as the first city to fall in the conquest of Canaan, the whole city and all of its spoils were devoted to the Lord. So it's the same idea as the firstborn or the first kill of the sacrifice that belonged to the Lord. And so generally in those days, then when you took over a city, then you got all the property of that city, and they divided up among the army. But they were commanded that everything goes in. You're not allowed to take any spoils of war. And Joshua said, all the silver, gold, articles of bronze, and iron are sacred to the Lord and must go into his treasury. And in that way, it was like a tithe to God, the Lord who gave them the victory. And then the people were to honor him with the first fruits of the conquest. So Achan violated this order and brought ruin on himself and his family. So what did Achan do? Said, after the destruction of Jericho, then Joshua placed a curse on anyone who might rebuild the city, which we already read about that. That was where he was a prophet. And so Jericho remained unoccupied until the times of the prophets Elisha and Elijah. And that was about 500 years later. And then Joshua's prophecy was fulfilled when Hiel of Bethel rebuilt the city, and it cost him his 2 sons. We'll read about that in 1 Kings. The Jericho is mentioned briefly in the book of Judges, which says that Jericho served as a provincial outpost for Eglon, the king of Moab, who held Israel under tribute for 18 years. And then it's mentioned again in 1 Chronicles, when King David sent word of his mistreated delegates to remain in Jericho until their beards regrew. And then in 2 Kings, Jericho appears to have been the home of a school of prophets. You read about the school of prophets? Yeah, okay. I always thought that YWAM should have a school of prophets. We'll see. Then also reported at Jericho was Elisha's miraculous purifying of a spring. And then during the reign of Ahaz, a group of prisoners were spared, and then they were fed and clothed and cared for at Jericho. So, and then the final mention is in Jericho was the capture of King Zedekiah after fleeing the Chaldean army in 2 Kings. That's the last time you hear about it in the Old Testament. And then Ezra and Nehemiah report that the number of Jericho's inhabitants after the return from exile under Zerubbabel was about 345, and that these sons of Jericho participated in the rebuilding of the walls. So Jericho played a minor role in Jesus' ministry. So we do hear about that. So Jesus healed 2 blind men near the city of Jericho. We see that in Matthew 20. Then he also encountered Zacharias, the chief tax collector, who he saw up in a tree. That was in Jericho. And when Jesus then dined in the home of Zacharias, said he was probably visiting one of the finest houses in Jericho, because Zacharias was a very rich man. And then the Gospels seem to indicate that Jericho had many beggars, even though it was a very affluent city. Matthew 20:29, we see that. There's some condemnation for that. And then Jericho of the New Testament there's a new Jericho that was rebuilt by Herod more than a mile to the south of the Old Testament location at the river Wadi. And so now there's a modern-day city of Jericho, which includes both sites. So in 6, you'll see they marched around the city. They marched around 7 times around the city with the ark, and 7 priests blowing the trumpets in front. On the 7th day, they circled the city 7 times. And after that, the people shouted, the walls fell down, and the Israelites were able to enter from everywhere. So, do you believe that story?
Yes.
Fact or myth? Fact? Fact? Don't know? Fact? Fact. Myth? Anybody myth? Myth? No. I think it's true. Yeah, there's a lot of people that don't believe that, but let's see.
It's
So,
helpful for you guys. There's a map in the back of your Bible that shows, like, you guys can see where they're crossing.
they see the city.
With Jericho. Yeah.
So, what really happened at Jericho? We're going to find out.
Jericho is said to be the oldest continuously inhabited city on the planet. And at 800 feet below sea level, it also holds the record for the lowest city in the world. That's right, you can't live any lower than Jericho. Well, I guess you could dig a tunnel under Jericho, call it a town, elect yourself mayor, and voila, new world record. But Jericho doesn't suffer from any inferiority complex being so low. It is actually quite popular as a tourist destination. Must have a ski resort. Can't wait to try the black diamonds. The city of Jericho is one of the most excavated sites in Israel. German excavations at the beginning of the 20th century revealed houses of mud brick built right into the fortified walls. Some tie that evidence to the Joshua chapter 2 passage about Rahab. Then she let them down by a rope through the window, for her house was built into the city wall, so that she lived in the wall. Now, starting with the Canaanites, sometime in the Middle Bronze Age, a wall was constructed around the city. Now, this wall would later become the most famous wall in the world after Joshua and the Israelites came knocking after they crossed the Jordan River at the end of their 40-year wilderness wanderings. Now, the Bible says that Jericho was the first stop for the Israelites after they crossed the Jordan River into the Promised Land. Now, imagine the scene. You're a Canaanite security guard, and you look out this direction, and you see more people approaching than you've ever seen in your entire life. I cannot imagine what he must have been thinking, but I bet it was not, welcome to Jericho. Come, stay a while, have some tea. Marry my daughter. Now, most of us know what happened next. The Israelites, led by the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant, marched around the city once a day for 6 days. Then, on day 7, they marched around 7 times, after which the priests blew their trumpets, everyone shouted, and suddenly the seemingly impregnable walls of Jericho came crashing down. It's one of the most dramatic moments in the Old Testament. But did it really happen? Is there any evidence of this amazing story? For many years, due to the research by the famous archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon, the answer was no. Due to her misdating the destruction of the city, there was a huge discrepancy between the archaeological record and that of the Bible. However, if one properly dates the city's destruction to roughly 1400 BC, things quite literally begin to fall into place. Now, I'm standing in front of this lower part of a retaining wall in the ancient ruins of Jericho. Now, this part of the retaining wall, this lower part, you can see is built out of these huge rocks. Now, up above it would have been built out of a reddish mud brick. Now, what archaeologists have discovered is that the reddish mud brick fell outward into this area right here and would have provided a perfect siege ramp for the Israelites to walk into the city to conquer Jericho. Now, did you get that? Archaeologists have uncovered the remains of mud brick walls, which had been supported by a stone retaining wall. These mud brick walls had fallen outward and created a ramp of sorts up into the city. This evidence is what we'd expect to find after reading the Joshua 6 accounts. As soon as the people heard the sound of the trumpet, the people shouted a great shout, and the wall fell down flat, so that the people went up into the city, every man straight before him, and they captured the city.
That's advertisement. Okay, so who wants to read that?
For though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does. The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they should have divine power to demolish strongholds. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. And we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. And we will be ready to punish every act of disobedience once your obedience is complete.
All right, so it was God's victory. All right, so that was their first city that they saw when they entered the Promised Land, and they conquered that in a mighty way. Then they went to Ai. How do they pronounce that on your audio Bible? Ai? 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 Ai?
So we have a letter, we don't have.
Ai? Ai? Okay. So, 1 Chronicles 27 refers to Achan as the troubler of Israel, who broke faith in the matter of the devoted king, the devoted thing. In the days of Joshua, when the Reubenites and Gadites and half-tribe of Manasseh built their own altar east of the river, the other tribes used the story of Achan as a warning. That do not rebel against the Lord or against us by building an altar for yourself other than the altar of the Lord our God. When Achan, son of Zerah, was unfaithful in regard to the devoted things, did not wrath come on the whole community of Israel? He was not the only one who died for his sin. So who was the troubler named Achan, and what did he do? You'll read about that today. So the story of Achan is found in chapter 7, and God had delivered Jericho into the Israelites' hands, and he had, which we saw in Joshua 6, and they had been instructed to destroy everything in the city with the exception of Rahab and her family, as well as the city's gold, silver, bronze, and iron. And the metals were supposed to go into the tabernacle treasury, and because they were sacred to the Lord. See that in Joshua 6:19. They would be devoted to him. And so Jericho was totally destroyed, and the Israelites were to take the plunder and give it to the Lord. They were not supposed to take anything for themselves. So then shortly after the success of Jericho, the Israelites moved into the next city in their path, and that was Ai. Again, the spies Joshua sent to Ai thought that this city would be easy to overtake, much easier than Jericho. And they suggested Joshua only send 2,000 or 3,000 troops. And then much to their shock, how many did he send into Jericho? Do you remember? If you've read that before. Look at that today when you read it. How many troops? He had a large number, but then he told them to reduce it down. That's part of the amazing story. Said much to their shock, the Israelites were chased out of Ai, and 36 of them were killed. And then so Joshua tore his clothes and bemoaned their attempts at conquering Canaan, and he told God, the Canaanites and other people of the country will hear about this, and they will surround us and wipe out our name from the earth. What will you do for your own great name? So he's kind of challenging God of like, you're you're our commander, you're our victorious leader. This makes you look bad, Lord. And so God responds by telling Joshua that some Israelites had sinned by taking devoted things in Jericho. So the people were to consecrate themselves, and then the following morning, the perpetrator would be identified by lot. So by lot was like drawing straws or something like that, which is kind of scary. They believed that the Lord would reveal that person in that way. So then morning came, and each tribe presented itself. Tribe of Judah was chosen by lot. And they went, oh. And then the clan of Zerahites, and then the family of Zimri, and then Achan was identified. Then Joshua said to Achan, my son, give glory to the Lord, the God of Israel, and honor him. Tell me what you have done. Do not hide it from me. Joshua 7:19. So Achan confessed his sin, admitting that in Jericho he saw a robe, 200 shekels of silver, and a 50 shekel bar of gold. And he wanted it. He coveted it. And so he took it, and then he hid it in a hole behind his tent. Oh no, within his tent. He went inside his tent. I guess he had some cloth carpet down or something. He dug a hole and buried it and hid it. So it didn't really do him any good. But the messengers from Joshua then went to the tent, and they looked around. They found a freshly dug hole covered up, and they found the things that he had stolen. So they brought it before the assembly, and then what do you think happens to Achan?
Stoned to death.
Stoned to death, yes. So he was stoned. His children, his livestock, and they burned the bodies, and then they also burned Achan's tent, the plunder he had taken, and all that he had in the valley of Achor, the valley of trouble. Thank you. So the piles of stone were left there as a reminder of Achan's sin and the high cost of disobeying God. So after Achan was judged, God told Joshua, do not be afraid, do not be discouraged. Take the whole army with you and go up and attack Ai, for I have delivered into your hands the king of Ai, his people, his city, and his land. And that's in Joshua 8. So the Israelites laid an ambush, and this was kind of a cool strategy for the, so they laid an ambush. So what they did is they sent a small group of Israelites, and important difference was this time they were allowed to take the plunder. So they had some incentive now to go in. So they laid an ambush, and then they killed all of the inhabitants of Ai. And they did take the plunder, and really every city after that they sacked, they got plunder. Only Jericho was the one that they had to give to the Lord. So Achan was, he could have had all the plunder of later cities, but he had that coveting those things that he saw, so he ended that way, sorry. So the story of Achan is a reminder of the penalty of sin, which is death. And also when they talked about Achan, then it was a sin that did not just affect him, it affected his family, and it affected the whole tribe, all the tribes, because they lost that city and people died in the initial battle. So Israel wanted to conquer Ai with a small army, but got defeated, and the reason for that was that Israel had sinned, and tribe by tribe, clan by clan, household by household, everyone was to come forward until the Lord revealed the culprit, Achan, and he was stoned to death along with his sons and daughters. So we see two truths illustrated, is that one, sin is never an isolated event. It has like this ripple effect. You know, you throw a stone in the water and you see the ripples. and it touches others. So sin is not, you can't just sin without affecting other people. And then Achan's sin led to the death of the 36 soldiers, and then the defeat of the whole army in the initial battle of Ai. And then second, we can always be sure that our sin will be found out. So he tried to hide his sin. He tried to bury it in his tent, in a hole in his tent. And Numbers 32:23. Let's see what that said. Numbers 32:23. But if you fail to keep your word, then you will have sinned against the Lord, and you may be sure that your sin will be found out. So Achan did not read that. So hiding the evidence in the tent did not conceal it from the Lord. And so his sin was considered very serious because he was stealing from the Lord. It was the Lord's tithe. So the Israelites had been specifically warned about consequences of not doing what God instructed, and so this was not. They couldn't say that they were surprised. This was just the consequence of that sin. So Joshua told them, keep away from the devoted things so that you will not bring about your own destruction by taking any of them. Otherwise you will make the camp of Israel liable to destruction and bring trouble on it. It's Joshua 6:18. And Achan's sin was a clear and willful violation of a direct order, and he did bring trouble on the entire camp of Israel. So Achan was given time to repent on his own. He could have come forward at any time, but he waited until they basically identified him by casting of lots. And then rather than admit his guilt initially and maybe call on the mercy of God, or humble himself and demonstrate reverence to him, he attempted to hide. And then Proverbs 28:13, it says, whoever conceals their sin does not prosper, but the one who confesses and renounces them finds mercy. So again, the property he took was meant for the Lord. It was the Lord's possession. So he didn't just obey a direct order. He also, again, stole from the Lord and tried to cover it up. And so we read about that in Acts 5, the story of Ananias and Sapphira. Very similar warning against lying to God. So as to why Achan's entire family was destroyed, that's a bit hard to understand maybe, but most likely they were complicit in the sin. They knew he had hid it, and complicit just means they were in agreement. And so maybe they should have turned him in or something, but I don't know. We don't know why. But so also perhaps that their execution, the family's execution, was a demonstration of just how pure the Israelites were called to be. So we can see from that story how deceptive sin can be. In the midst of this miraculous victory, then Achan is enticed by a robe and some silver and some gold, and none of that compares to the miracle and the power of God that he had just witnessed. Yet we all know how easily our hearts can be swayed, so sometimes we can see the power of God and we kind of overlook that. And so it says each person is tempted when they are dragged away from by their own evil desire and enticed, and then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. So James 1:14 and 15 tells us that, and we see that right here. It did result in death. And another aspect of sin's deception is that it promises a benefit that it can't deliver. So stealing that stuff did him no good. He hid it in a hole in his tent, So he couldn't spend the money. He was probably freaked out. He couldn't get caught. And he couldn't wear the clothes. He couldn't wear the robe. So what seemed like it was of great worth to him was actually worthless, buried in a hole. And so that festered this guilt in his heart. So in Joshua 7:21, when he finally confesses the sin, he relays that whole thing of like, I saw, I covered it, and I took it. So this is the same process that leads many of us to sin today. When we see something, we covet it, and then we take it. Then we are being deceived by sin, just as Achan was. So James 1:16 says, "Don't be deceived, my dear brothers and sisters. Every good, perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. He chose to give us birth through the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of all he created." So real blessings come from the Lord. They don't come through pleasures of sin. That's a huge lesson that many of us spend our whole life learning. Yeah, my older brother just died. He would have been, just last week, an Easter weekend, he would have been 83 yesterday. He had very poor health. It was time for him to go. I mean, he had like cancer, he had heart disease, and the heart disease finally did him in. But yeah, he had been married 3 times and divorced twice. His second wife died of cancer, but he was always led away by the pleasure of sin. There was a lot of adultery in his life. He was adulterous with his first wife, and then got involved with this really beautiful redhead. Still, he was enticed by the pleasures of sin, and then divorced his wife and married her. And I, after I got out of law school, actually went and worked with him in his law office. And then, this is a weird story, but he was having an affair with this girl named Rose, and he was married to his second wife, who he had an adulterous affair with, divorced his wife, and then married. Now he's having so that sin, that adulterous sin of adultery, just became a habit in his life. And so he was having an affair with Rose, and Tyler, they had this bank called Rose Capital Bank. And so all the employees in the office, they were like, "Where's Bob?" And they were like, "Oh, he went to the bank." Like, the Rose. And I was like, "Oh God, this is embarrassing." So, but I think of that in this story when I read something like that. He was looking for and he said he was a Christian, but I don't know. He just had that problem. And one day his wife called, his second wife called, and like, "So where's Bob?" And I said, "No, Bob's not here." And I didn't tell her he'd gone to the bank. And she started crying and said, "I know he's having an affair." And I was like, I have to get out of here. I actually, at that point, I went out on my own and didn't work with my brother again after that, because it was just too weird. But anyway, see that, I'm sure you have stories like that in your own life. So. Or people in your own, hopefully not in your own life, but people, but people that you know. But anyway, throughout the Bible, we do find mercy accompanies judgment, even in the story of Achan. So God was merciful in limiting the destruction caused by Achan's sin. So he quickly restored the nation of Israel after the sin was dealt with. And then in Joshua 8, we see Israel defeated Ai and renew their covenant with the Lord. And so God forgives, and he desires to be in relationship with his people. Even when we do not understand or obey his commands, we can trust his character. He's unchanging. He's the giver of good things. So the story of Achan is a warning, but is also one of hope. So enjoy reading that story. So they did have victory after that little problem was taken care of, and then after Israel made things right with the Lord, they did defeat Ai, and then Joshua wrote the law on stones and led the people to renewing their covenant with God. So let me ask you for like all the, am I speaking too fast? No? Yeah? Okay. Huh? I speak too fast? Okay. Huh? Good? Yeah? People that don't have English as a first language, sometimes I forget that. In Nepal, I'm used to speaking with a translator, so that's always good because you can say something and then they say something and then you have time to think. But then the challenge is, I always start talking like an Indian when I'm there because I'm trying to talk to the translator guy, which is weird, but it works. So I won't do that to you. So.
I can come and translate for you.
Huh?
I can come and translate for you.
Oh, okay. You can translate. I like working with translators most of the time until I find out that they're not really translating what I say. If you have a good translator, he can kind of clean up what you're trying to say, you know. So that's all right. All right, so in the second battle of Ai, God noted that Joshua must not fight according to the recommendations of his commanders until, so this talks about the ambush. So it was the Lord's idea. So the Lord made the point that success requires careful planning. And so God demanded holiness, but he also took seriously the threat and planned the operation to accomplish the mission. So we can see another character trait of God, that he's very detailed and he will plan the attack, you know. So initially 5,000 of the 30,000 men that Joshua had, 5,000 of the 30,000 hid in ambush between Bethel and Ai on the west side of Ai. So unlike the first time, the enemy underestimated the forces. They looked out, they just thought there was not that many. And so the frontal attack was the forces of Ai hurried to meet the attack and pursue the soldiers. And they figured we already beat them once, and now they don't have as many people, and so we're going to beat them again. So they ran out of the city, and says so in 8:18 through 29, it says, once the enemy left their protection and chased the troops a sufficient distance, Joshua signaled the ambush to begin as God directed him. He said, hold out toward Ai the javelin that is in your hand, for into your hand I will deliver the city. And the ambush succeeded. So basically they fooled the people, and so when they brought a small force in, everybody ran out, and then the main force attacked the city and took it over and wasn't able to protect it. So the Bible describes this comparatively insignificant battle at Ai in more detail than Jericho, which is an interesting fact. But we could reason that the lessons that we learned in Ai are more important than the collapse of the walls at Jericho. So the defeat at Ai teaches us about the danger of coveting and disobeying the Lord's commands, and then that one should never underestimate the enemy, and this ever-present danger demands a total dedication to resources, careful planning, and decisive action by the leader. So in other words, they had just won Jericho in this amazing fight, and they were just complacent and thought, okay, well, this is going to be easy. We'll just do this really quick. And they got defeated and also because of Achan's sin. So the heaps of stones can teach every generation the Lord ultimately provides victory when they eliminate sin and work with God against evil. So that's a lesson that we can have, is just eliminate sin. That's not easier said than done, but that's the message. So together, God and obedient followers can conquer any enemy. You really believe that? You had times of trouble or trials, and you say, God is fighting my battles. I've said that many times, and sometimes I wonder if it's true. but I have faith that he is. I do really have faith that he is. So the covenant renewal that they did completes the narrative on the crossing the Jordan and these initial victories. And then at Mount Ebal, the community reflects on and reaffirms that covenant relationship with the Lord and prepares for possessing the remainder of the land. And that ceremony at Mount Ebal reminds the tribal members of the covenant requirement for God's people. And how long this agreement will survive depends on the people's faithfulness. And in this sense, that ceremony at Mount Ebal closes the early campaign and parallels in function with Joshua 24, which is toward the end of the chapter. All right, so let's go into chapter 9. So the defeat of Ai caused the remaining kings of the surrounding cities to unite against Israel. But Gibeon, that's not far from Gilgal, then that's where the Israelites were camped. They decide that they want an alliance with Israel, but they know that the Lord has commanded all the people in that area to be annihilated. And so they come in with this deception, pretending that they were not from that land, they were from another country. And so as a consequence, Joshua did not destroy that city. It made them slaves. So Gibeonites were an interesting group of people. They had descended from the Amorites. We know that in 2 Samuel. And they are described as people who deceived the Israelites in order to protect themselves. So after the Israelites defeated the cities of Jericho and Ai, then many of the Canaanites joined into an alliance. But the Gibeonites took a different approach, and they resorted to a ruse. You know what a ruse is? A ruse is a con game. It was a con. So they went as a delegation, and they took their donkeys, they loaded their donkeys up, they made them really dusty and worn out, and they had old wineskins, old sacks, they cracked. It was like a drama. They were like playing a part. And they put worn patches on their sandals, and on their feet they wore old clothes, old dusty clothes, huh?
Old bread.
Yeah, the old bread. They had old bread, and it was all moldy. They got all the moldy bread together. And then they went to Joshua's camp at Gilgal and said, "Oh, Joshua, we have come from a distant land. We have traveled far. Can you make a treaty with us?" You know, and the problem is that the Israelites did not consult with God before that, so they tried to do that on their own. That's really the lesson of the story. But the Israelites found out soon that they'd been tricked, and they discussed how to respond. But and they said, "We have given them our oath by the Lord that we cannot touch them now. So this is what we will do. We will let them live so that the Lord's wrath will not fall on us for breaking the oath we have swore to them. And we will let them live, but let them be woodcutters and water carriers in the service of the whole community." So basically, so the leader's promise to them was kept. That's in Joshua 9:19. And so basically they became slaves. That was their... and then at the end of the account, it says that it's noted that Joshua made the Gibeonites woodcutters and water carriers for the assembly to provide for the needs of the altar of the Lord at the place the Lord would choose. So they kind of did this evangelism by force. They made the slaves serve the Lord. So I mean, how many of them became Christian followers? You know, I'm sure it tells us that. So the Gibeonites survived, but they served as slaves for the Israelites for generations. And then the land that Gibeon had would later be allotted to the tribe of Benjamin.
You think they become confident after they conquer other lands, so that's why they didn't ask God, or like
Yeah, probably they became.
Josh and the elders also.
I
like
think.
just didn't,
Yeah.
they didn't ask him, so they felt like confidence. Oh, we did. Yeah, it's the easiest thing we can do by our own. Or,
Yeah, I think that's what happened. Anyway, anybody think that? I think they probably became self-sufficient, like, oh, we've already done that. We can take care of this problem. Yeah, I think so. Okay, but later, then King Saul broke that treaty that Joshua had signed and attacked the Gibeonites. And then during that time of King David, a famine occurred in Israel because of Saul's breaking that promise. So David asked the Lord about the famine, and God said, it is on account of Saul and his blood-stained house. It is because he put the Gibeonites to death. So even though they were deceptive, God honored the leader's promises to the Gibeonites. That's what I said in my testimony. You have to be careful what you say, because God will hold you to it sometimes like that. So to appease the Gibeonites and put an end to the famine, 7 descendants of Saul were given to them to put to death. So so God healed Israel's land after that. So the Gibeonites were enemies of Israel. They teach us important lessons that the Gibeonites' deception was effective because Joshua and his people did not first consult God's wisdom. So Joshua 9 reveals the need for believers in Christ to pray concerning all major decisions and to seek his will before moving forward. Does everybody do that? Try. I say that all the time. I'll pray about it. But then I already know what I'm going to do. I'll pray about it. and I think, oh, maybe I should really pray about it. So also the fact that the Lord held the Israelites to the covenant that they made with the Gibeonites shows that God requires his people to be faithful to their word. So another character of God. He's faithful and you shall be faithful. He's holy and you shall be holy. So breaking a covenant was a serious thing. So don't make a covenant you're going to break. So the eventual incorporation of Gibeonites into Israel's shows that the mercy and grace of God to all his people, they actually became part of the nation of Israel at a later time. Okay, the southern conquest. Where am I? Southern conquest. Here, the kings from the south mobilized against Gibeon, and Joshua came to their help. And then the Lord helped Joshua defeat 5 Amorite kings. He threw their enemy into a panic. He threw down stones at the enemy, that was hail, and made the sun and the moon stand still. So this is another interesting fact of God goes before you. He was going before them and actually winning the fight for them. So Joshua's counterattack on the 5 kings demonstrates that he had learned 2 lessons from the previous battles. He fights a wise, well-planned operation, and victory depends on support from the Lord. And then Joshua launches he launches a forced march. It was a 32-kilometer journey that was very demanding and up a steep climb from Gilgal. And then the night march ensured the victory by an element of surprise as the coalition troops were thrown into confusion. See a good movie here, I don't know. The other side of the victory is that the Lord hurled hail down, hailstorm, upon the troops that were fleeing at the descent of Beth Horon. So he was helping kill the enemy too. More soldiers died from the hail than from the actual battle. And God's hail storm emphasizes that the dependence on the tribal forces that have support from a divine warrior. So again, it was God's victory. In Joshua 10:13 says the valley of Ajalon and Gibeon are also so oriented that early in the morning a person will see the sun rising in the east over Gibeon and the moon setting in the west over the valley. So the Lord's control over the moon and sun gave the people an extended day that would allow them time to complete their victory. So the narrator explains that extraordinary day when the Lord listened to a man and affirmed that the Lord was fighting for Israel. So basically Joshua asked him to do that, and he did that. So the reports of victories in the southern part of the land follow some form common in the ancient Near East. As in the book of Joshua, those reports vary in size and style, but the reports on the victories and important conquest are generally long and involved, whereas the routine raids are described in stereotyped summaries etched in standing stone. So the southern campaign summaries began with Makkaday and moved city to city until Debir. So that's a part where I think Bible Project says that's a little boring, but you get through it. And then the narrative summarized Joshua's subjugation of the region from Kadesh Barnea to Gaza and from Goshen to Gibeon. So 3 major themes appear in the reports. First, the Lord gives each city and king to the tribal federation. He said, I will give these cities to you. And then second, Joshua and the people carefully carry out the demands of Herem. Herem? Herem? H-E-R-E-M? Herem? Harim? Harim? Okay. Okay, so what is Harim? Harim comes from Exodus 22:19. It says, whoever sacrifices to a god other than the Lord alone will be prescribed haram. And in that context, it presumably means destruction. They will die. And that's a punishment for someone who makes sacrifices to another god. And then third, Joshua captures the region in the campaign because the Lord fights for Israel. So when you read those summaries, you can look and see that they do not mention the destruction of either Jerusalem or Gezer. Both fortresses remained in place, and the region has come under the general control of the tribal forces by these raids. So this is the moving into the land, taking the land just as he promised. All right, so then the southern and central campaigns from the military camp at Gilgal launched 2 campaigns, thus conquering central and southern Canaan. In Joshua 10:23 says the 5 Canaanite kings had formed this coalition, and that was the kings of Jerusalem, Hebron, Jarmuth, Lachish, and Eglon. And Joshua said, open the mouth of the cave and bring these 5 kings out to me. So they brought the 5 kings out, and when they had brought these kings to Joshua, he summoned all the men of Israel and said to the army commanders who had come with him, come here and put your feet on the necks of these kings. So they can come forward. So they came forward and placed their feet on their necks. And then Joshua said, don't be afraid. Do not be discouraged. Be strong and courageous. This is what the Lord will do to all the enemies you are going to fight. And then Joshua put the kings to death, exposed their bodies on 5 poles, and they were left hanging on the poles until evening. And then at sunset, Joshua gave the order, and they took them down and threw them into the cave where they had been hiding. And at the mouth of the cave, they placed large rocks, which are still there, I think. So then Joshua went to each city, Makkedah, Libnah, Lachish, Eglon, Hebron, Debir, and totally destroyed each city and left no survivors. So they were told in Joshua, that started in Joshua 10:40, says, so Joshua subdued the whole region, including the hill country, the Negev, the western foothills, and the mountain slopes, together with all their kings. He left no survivors. He totally destroyed all who breathed, just as the Lord, the God of Israel, had commanded. And then Joshua subdued them from Kadesh Barnea to Gaza and from the whole region to Goshen to Gibeon. All these kings of their land Joshua conquered in one campaign because the Lord, the God of Israel, fought for Israel, and then Joshua returned with all Israel to camp at Gilgal. And then we get into chapters 11 and 12. It says the kings from the north are defeated, and then there's a summary of conquest. So then you have the northern campaigns, that after conquering central and southern Canaan, Joshua took his forces northward to Hazor. So chapter 12 points out the importance of leadership and praises the fighting of the people as keys to defeating the enemy. And the list of eastern kings includes border descriptions, while the list of defeated kings west of the Jordan mentions 31 kings by city. Just an interesting observation. All right, so now we've got the 12 tribes of Israel. I saw this, I got this off the internet, but I don't know exactly. I always thought Judah had a lion on it at one point, but I don't know. So the 12 tribes of Israel were the tribes of Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, which is represented by Ephraim and Manasseh, and Benjamin. All right. Interesting that some of the famous people from these tribes, tribe of Levi, Aaron, Moses, and Eli, and John the Baptist. And Judah, you got Caleb, David, Solomon, Isaiah, and Jesus Christ. Tribe of Dan, Samson, Naphtali, Barak, Elijah, and tribe of Joseph, Ephraim, and Manasseh, Joshua, Gideon, Samuel. And the tribe of Benjamin is Saul, Esther, and the Apostle Paul. All right, let's see. Where is it? My cup's in the way. Let's see. There's an article that I thought was pretty cool, but I don't think I'm going to read that. I can post this article if you want to read it later. That's kind of interesting, though. Who wants to read that? Okay.
There's a very important promise that God initially made to Abraham in Genesis 12. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Genesis 12:3. The reason this makes sense is because the nation of Israel, specifically the tribe of Judah, formed the lineage connected to the birth of Jesus. When you read Matthew 1, you will see this genealogy listed out. It is the death and resurrection of Jesus, whose earthly lineage is of the tribe of Judah, that brought salvation to all mankind, thus fulfilling the prophecy of Genesis 12. All the nations, peoples, and families of the world have been blessed through Abraham's lineage because of Jesus. Genesis 49 refers to Jesus as the lion. This is mentioned again in Revelation when Jesus is referred to as the lion of the tribe of Judah.
Okay, thank you. All right, let's see. All right, so the rest of the book, you see distribution of the land in chapters 13 through 21 to the different tribes. You see that in chapter 18 through 19, then you got 7 tribes that are getting land that still needs to be conquered. 20 is the city of refuge. 21 is the cities for the Levites. So settlement of the tribes is after the conquest of the promised land under Joshua, the land formerly occupied by the Canaanites was assigned to the descendants of the sons of Jacob. And so the map is kind of cool. Is this in the back of our book? Or the back of the Bible?
Yeah.
My light's not working. Anyway, so you can kind of see the where the different tribes are. Is that map in the back?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Let's see. So in chapter 13, we're told that Joshua is old, 90 or 100 years old, and the introduction tells the readers that the tribes can no longer expect Joshua to lead them into conquest. Just too old. And because of his age. And so instead, the completion of the struggle now depends on the tribes. So the followers must become courageous leaders. This is God's bad news that goes with the good news of them getting an inheritance. So sometimes you get an inheritance and it comes with a set of challenges. And so in, I don't know, in other countries, in America, sometimes you get an inheritance and that comes with taxes. And depending on the amount, you do have an exemption for some inheritance taxes, but it could be a challenge. Others, restricted since the land stretched from the Jordan River on the east to the Great Sea, Mediterranean Sea on the west. So Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh eventually inhabited land east of the Jordan. And then from north to south, it covered the territory between the Sinai Peninsula and the ancient coastal nation of Phoenicia. Land was allotted to the descendants of all Jacob's sons except Levi. And then Levi's portion went to the 2 sons of Joseph, who were Manasseh and Ephraim. So the Levites were set apart for priestly service, and their portion was to be God himself. And we see that in Numbers 18:20. However, God provided 18 cities throughout Palestine for use by the Levites. And you can see that. So this map shows the approximate location of the settlements based on the boundaries mentioned. Okay, then there's this, what they call the Transjordan tension in chapter 23. It says Joshua 22 reports Joshua's speech at Shiloh, and he commends the East Bank tribes for their support of the battles to take over the land on the west of the Jordan, helping the tribes receive their inheritance. They have been faithful to their promise made to Moses, and now the western tribes have rest from extensive warfare. Then he gives permission to the eastern tribes to return with their booty, their spoils of war, to their inherited land and to share the spoils with their families. And then finally the eastern tribes leave for home. But before they cross the river, they leave on the western side of Jordan a large altar. That was a mistake, actually, because it brought some problems. Because that altar made the other tribes angry because they misunderstood, and then there became threats of war. You had the 10 tribes send Phinehas, who was the son of Eleazar the priest, to negotiate a peaceful settlement to what borders on a religious war. So the Western delegation confronted the Eastern leaders with a list of charges, and they angrily attacked the integrity of the leaders. They said, "You're devised new ways or new place to worship the Lord, and that's just, just like, that's a sin against the Lord, because the Lord has told you where to worship, and now you're doing something different. So they say, how could you turn away from the Lord and build yourself an altar in rebellion against him? And they are afraid that the altar will anger God, and then they will all be punished. So they're not really worried about those tribes' salvation. They're worried about what God's going to do to them. So they're more like self-preservation. And if the altar violates the command and God gets angry, then the western tribes will share the blame to the eastern tribes. And then the eastern leaders respond quite graciously. Now, whether we just assumed this was their plan, or whether they were just really clever and they had a good lawyer and came up with a good response. So they basically said, we're sorry, we'll willingly take whatever punishment that we deserve from God, but hear us out. We did not intend to rebel against God. In fact, what we did, we thought that the western tribes would someday look at us on the east side of the Jordan, and they'll say, the Lord has made the Jordan a boundary between us and you. You Reubenites and Gadites, you have no share in the Lord. So your descendants may cause our descendants to stop fearing the Lord. So they said, in this way, we have built an altar as a reminder. So it's not an alternative altar for sacrifices. That's not our intention. Our intention was to build this altar to let us, said, not for burnt offerings and sacrifices, but on the contrary, it's a witness between us and you and the generations that follow, that we all worship the same Lord at his sanctuary with our burnt offerings and sacrifices and fellowship offerings. So first they say they fear the tribes of Canaan will one day shut them out of the worship center in the west and not allow them to come worship the Lord. Second, that the eastern tribes think that building a replica of the western altar will keep their descendants true to God rather than replace the place of worship. So it is a replica visible to the east. And third, that the replica will remind the western tribes that those in the east also desire God, and they that witness will bring unity to the tribes on the east-west border. And so the leaders of the west went, okay, we misunderstood. We thought you were doing this and you're doing that. That's cool. They believed them. So in the Bible, altars are common witnesses, and so in their defense, the tribes clarify that there's misunderstanding. They turned the building of an altar from an act of rebellion into a witness of religious unity and source of revival. So the western tribes went back and reported that to the people, and everything was okay. But it was like an interesting, almost civil war. All right, so then the epilogue in chapter 23 and 24. So Joshua's farewell address in chapter 23 and 24, it provides a conclusion to the book as a whole. There's a comparison in chapter 23 and 24, suggests that chapter 23 was probably spoken to specifically the leaders of Israel. It's in 23:2, whereas chapter 24 was to the whole assembly. And chapter 23, Joshua rehearses the mighty acts of God on Israel's behalf in giving them the land of promise, and then exhorts the leaders to continue in faithfulness in the future. And then in chapter 24, it constitutes a covenant renewal ceremony in which all of Israel commits herself to serve the Lord and reject the worship of all false gods. So the form of the covenant here, as well as in Deuteronomy, is recognized based on common ancient treaty formulas. So there's a preamble, says, thus says the Lord God of Israel. Then there's a historical prologue in verses 2 through 13. Then there's a covenant stipulation and requirements in verses 14, 15. And then warnings against covenant disobedience in verses 19, 20. And then witnesses in verse 22, and a depositing of the covenant document in verse 26. So then in chapters 24, 29 through 33, the book of Joshua ends and sets the context for the book of Judges. Here Joshua and Eleazar both die. The religious leaders of the tribes will govern no more. A new generation will rise to the challenge to challenge the people to commitment. The bones of Joshua are then buried in Shechem in the burial cave of Jacob. The bones of Joseph are buried in Shechem in the burial cave of Jacob as Joseph had requested. And the land now belongs to the tribes, and their ancestors rest in Canaan. So at the same time, Joshua is called the servant of the Lord. That is more important than his age of 110 years. He's recognized as a servant of the Lord, and Joshua, the 1:1 refers to Joshua as Moses' aide and assistant, but now he is a servant of the Lord in his own right. So now at his death, he's promoted to a true servant of the Lord. So the death narrative recognizes that Joshua lived and died as a servant of God after his mentor, Moses, and in the same way. And then Eleazar, son of Aaron, also dies, and he's buried in Ephraim, which was given to his son Phinehas. And then, so we have the personal application. Who wants to read that?
One of the key verses in the book of Joshua is 1:8. Do not let this book of the law depart from your mouth. Meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do everything written in it. The Old Testament is replete with stories of how the people forgot God and His Word and suffered the terrible consequences. For the Christian, the Word of God is our lifeblood. If we neglect it, our lives will suffer accordingly. But if we take to heart the principle of verse 1:8, we will be complete and able to be of use in God's kingdom, 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17. And we will find that God's promise in Joshua 1, verses 8 through 9, will be ours as well.
All right, so Joshua is a prime example of the benefits of being a worthy mentor. So he, for years, remained close to Moses. He watched Moses as he followed God in almost a flawless manner. We don't see any deception or any criticism of him. He learned to pray in a personal way from Moses. He learned how to obey through the example of Moses. Joshua apparently also learned from the negative example that cost Moses the joy of actually entering the promised land. And basically, if you're alive, and we're all alive, and we're all in YWAM, and we should all be a mentor. Somebody's watching us, and somebody is under our authority, either as leaders in a school or just as a staff or whatever. And people around here in DTS are watching you guys, like, oh, should I do that next? So you guys are mentors already. You don't even know it. Some younger person or someone that you are influenced is seeing how you live and how you react, and so you actually don't have to be in a formal mentoring process, but someone is learning from you, so someone will follow your example. So mentoring is far more than just the words spoken. It's an entire life on display. And so I would encourage you to take that away from this book of Joshua and the life of Joshua, that you should be a mentor. You should obey the Lord. You should be worthy of Him, His anointing on your life. You should follow His example, follow His lead, and obey Him always, and then take up this mantle of mentorship. So, and I finished right on time. I didn't even plan that. Oh my gosh. Thank you, Lord.
Thank you for all the teaching and wisdom.